Hello, and welcome to the fourth and final module in our Psychotherapy Foundation and Formulation Introduction. In the previous module, we were considering attachment and attachment patterns and styles as the inbuilt program within us for seeking help and reaching out to others when we're in distress. And we looked at the how secure or not we feel in our expectation that others are going to be consistently there for us. So we're going to sort of focus in a bit more in this module on the more specific roles and patterns of relationships that we might typically find ourselves in. So we're perhaps now asking you to think a bit more about some of the individual patterns that are very familiar to you. And then by the end of this module, we hope you'll be in a position then, considering all of the things we've thought about in these four modules, how that might influence what your goals might be for any further psychological work or therapy. So we really want, by the end of this, for you to have 2 or 3 key areas which you feel are really significant and important to focus on. We're going to consider in this module the different types of roles and patterns that we can all fall into in relation to ourselves and with others. We're all in what we call reciprocating patterns with each other. So for instance, for me to assume the role of teacher in this module, I need you to assume the role of learner in response to me. So I can't be a teacher without a learner to receive my teaching. And so this is an example of what we call a reciprocating role or pattern. Other typical roles might be that of the carer and the cared for, or I'm the victim and I'm relating to someone who's a perpetrator or an abuser. And I'll give another sort of brief topical example. So this was before the lockdown in relation to the coronavirus situation, but I had gone for a run and I suffer from asthma, which gets triggered when I exercise. And when I exercise, after I've finished exercising, I sometimes get a cough, which is I know this is my asthma because I get a wheezy cough. And at the end of my run, had needed to pop into the local shop to pick up some milk. We'd run out of milk. And I bumped into, in the shop, a friend of mine and his wife. They were doing some shopping. And we stopped and had a chat. But I was still having this cough from having been on this run. And I became incredibly self-conscious about this cough, feeling worried that my friend would be concerned that I am carrying the virus, and in having this cough that I would be a potential source of infection to him. And so I started to, and not just him actually, I started to feel incredibly self-conscious in the whole shop, as though everyone there would be judging me as an irresponsible citizen, as someone that, if I'm coughing like this, I'm displaying symptoms of coronavirus. So what am I doing just out there in the shop buying milk? So in that sense, I'd placed myself in the role of one being judged, and everyone else in the shop, particularly my friend and his partner, I'd placed in the role of judge. And so that's an example of a role, and it might be, I might be someone that carries with me that sense of myself, that I might often place myself in that role in different contexts in my life. So today, this is what we're going to invite you to start to think about. What roles do you tend to place yourself in more often in relation to others? And we're going to start to think about the impact of those roles for us on the quality of our relationships and on our mental well-being. So the roles and patterns that we frequently inhabit are likely to have got established, got formed from within our earlier experiences, within our families, our friendship groups. As children, we may have taken on certain roles within our family. For example, the joker, the caregiver, the one who's always giving to others, the studious one, the clumsy one, the angry one. When we're assigned a role, we can either take it on and inhabit it, or we can reject it and try to disown it or deny it. Or we might move from one part of the role relationship to the other. We'll give an example of that. So an example may be in the role of being cared for, moving to being the one that's caring. That might be a role pattern that's often there in all of our relationships. So such early relationship patterns get what we call internalized. So they become automatic for us. We sort of inhabit them without really thinking about it. And they get reenacted again and again throughout our lifetime with others and in relation to ourselves. So in this sense, these early patterns can become very familiar and automatic. This is just who I am, and it's what I know, really. I'm clumsy, or I'm unimportant and feel rejected most of the time, or I tend to give more than I get back from my relationships. These automatic patterns can become problematic and ineffective for us. We feel we're sort of stuck in a loop often. And it's the work of therapy where we try to explore these patterns in more detail and make sense of where they might have originated from, and how such ways of thinking and feeling can affect how we place ourselves in relation to others in our everyday, ordinary interactions. Here's another example to try to illustrate how we can move between the poles of these reciprocal roles. I'll try and explain. So, a friend complains that they feel that they never get asked out anymore to social events. They said they felt rejected when they recently looked on Facebook and saw that an event had been hosted where most of our mutual friends had been in attendance. And this had left this friend fearing that they were not good enough, and also brought up thoughts that they were boring, and left them feeling unconfident and rejected. Whilst I was feeling sorry for this friend's distress, I was curious about how this sense had come about for them and what part they might have played, if any, in this pattern getting established of them, often feeling that they were overlooked and rejected. Remember when we talked about mentalizing in the first module, we do try to aim to be curious, to understand ourselves and others in relation to these roles and patterns. So as we talked this through further together, what seemed to come to light was that this friend had a habit of cancelling either arranged meetups or not responding to text messages or invites on Facebook. In my friend's mind, they were cancelling because they had a right to do so, but they were also cancelling from this sense that they probably wouldn't be wanted or welcomed in these meetings. But I was curious about the amount of times they pulled out or cancelled social invitations, and tried to think with them really about what role they placed others in through doing this. So in this respect, my friend, who's often felt rejected, has also placed themselves in the role of rejecter by cancelling or not responding to invitations by text or on Facebook. In this sense, they'd seemed so invested in the role of being the one that's rejected that it took them by surprise actually to notice that they, perhaps unwittingly, had contributed to this pattern of rejecting or being rejected by others by their own rejecting of other people, to the point that they had pulled out or not responded to invitations to the extent that people thought maybe they don't want to spend time with me. So they'd assigned this role of rejecting, unaware that they contributed really to this role and pattern getting repeated time and time again. And I suppose it's such stuck roles and patterns that, where we're sort of inhabiting something without really stopping to think about it and reflect on it. You can see these automatic patterns as perhaps being a result of us having lost our mentalizing, lost our ability to sort of check in with ourselves about what's really going on. And we can get stuck in those sort of non-mentalizing kind of statements to ourselves about I'm always overlooked, I'm always rejected, or I'm the one who's always on time, or I'm the one that's neat and tidy, you're the messy one. Those sort of fixed patterns might be an indicator that we've lost our mentalizing. We perhaps need to challenge ourselves to think it through in a bit more detail. So in order to develop our understanding of these patterns of relating and the kinds of roles that we find ourselves falling into, we're going to look specifically at the example of Michelle, who's featured in our scenarios through the modules. You'll recall that Michelle became quite quiet during the meal that he'd prepared when it was his birthday, and seemingly Lila, his partner, had not recalled or remembered that it was his birthday. He also, you may remember, became quite distressed, it seemed, when he was attending Lila's family gathering, where it seems he felt a little bit left out, and started sending text messages to Lila. And then lastly, we considered how he had responded in the experience of Lila having gone away for a week, attending a course, and how this might have activated his attachment style. So in order to think about how to focus in a bit more on how Michel might position himself in certain roles, we're going to first look at, given what we know of him, how might he feel about himself? How might he see himself in the world? You'll see here on this picture we've captured the thoughts of one of the groups we've discussed these scenarios with. And they came up with, if you look under the circle that says self, you'll see that these ways of experiencing himself were suggested from the group. So he probably sees himself as very much he's unappreciated for what he gives. There's also, people highlighted a sense that he probably feels himself to be not good enough much of the time. So when he became distressed and uncomfortable in Lila's family gathering, he kind of turns it on himself and says, I'm making things much worse for you here. It'll be much better if I just left. Which suggests he has this view of himself as not being good enough, that he blames himself a lot. There's also a sense that he perhaps feels he gives more than he gets back. And in that sense, he feels himself perhaps to be less important to others. Although there may be two sides to that coin, that whilst much of the time he feels himself to be less important, maybe underlying that there's a sense of him deserving more affection than he does attract. And he probably also sees himself as the, in this sense that he gives more than he gets back, that he prioritizes his relationship more than others. Perhaps he sees himself as a considerate individual in that sense. He's sending these text messages to Lila while she's away. He's, worrying about her and how she's coping. So these are the ways that perhaps he sees himself in the world. But in contrast, he perhaps anticipates that other people are going to be largely busy, and perhaps that they're more selfish than he is, so that they're kind of putting their needs ahead of him, that they're not as considerate as he is, and essentially they're uncaring for him. So we can see a little bit here of how he views himself, maybe in contrast to how he expects others to be with him. So that he's considerate and others are not so considerate. He gives more, others are less caring in response. He's unseen, unappreciated. Other people are pretty busy with their own agenda. And then you can see in red, we asked the group, so if this is right, if this is how he tends to see and experience himself in the world, and this is how he tends to imagine other people are going to be in relation to him. How might this feel? What feelings might this generate in him? And the group came up with a range of different feelings here that essentially he feels ignored, that he might be angry, that he might feel jealous of the attention that others give elsewhere away from him. And linked to these feelings, he perhaps feels a deep sense of being rejected. And then underlying this, which links to the anger, that maybe he's a bit resentful of this dynamic and at times perhaps desperate. So we're starting to map out this relationship pattern that might be a sort of core feature for him in much of his experience in the world. And then in navy blue at the bottom of the page, we invited the group to consider, well, how, given this dynamic, this sense of himself that he's often overlooked, that others are sort of too busy and preoccupied with their own agenda, and these feelings that might generate, how does he cope with it? And people came up with different things. Said that he often, it seems that one of his coping mechanisms is to withdraw. So he drank all the wine. He blamed himself about things not going well in the family gathering. He sort of turns in on himself, really. That's how he deals with it. And also perhaps some people felt that he perhaps could become quite controlling. He tries to control the situation. He's trying to suggest how he and Lila spend the weekend upon her return. But maybe one of the things that this dynamic of himself feeling unappreciated is that he tries even harder to please people and make amends for this sense of his feeling that he's not good enough. And then he also, that links to his withdrawal, he's kind of, he's not really communicating what goes on inside himself. So there's a sense that he's perhaps squashing down some feelings. He may not even be aware of some of them. Maybe not so aware that he feels quite angry that Lila's giving her attention to all her family, but perhaps isn't able to kind of even mentalize about that in himself, but instead sort of just falls into this pattern of just taking the blame himself. So given these coping mechanisms, given this relationship pattern, we also asked the group, what, if you were really wanting him to have a better life, what goals might you want him to set? And these were in green here on the right hand side of the picture. You can see the goals that the group came up with. And firstly, there was a sense that he's perhaps got all of his eggs in this one basket with Lila, and that perhaps he needs to broaden his social network and life and broaden the sources of interpersonal contact in his life. Secondly, there was a sense that perhaps he needs to consider the expectations he has of others. There was a sense that perhaps he has very high expectations based on what he gives to other people. There was also a sense that maybe he needs to learn to relinquish or give up some of the degree of control he wants. And finally, there was a key goal for him that the group identified was that he needed to learn to express his feelings a bit more. So hopefully this has been a useful exercise to just go through, to break down the relationship pattern into how do I tend to view myself in the world? How do I tend to expect others are going to be with me? How does this dynamic leave me feeling? How do I cope with it? How do I find myself dealing with it? And then what might my goals be if I wanted to try and break into this dynamic and do things differently? Having gone through the exercise of mapping out Michel's roles and patterns, the sort of key experiences he has in relation to himself and others, and how that affects the quality of his relationships, the feelings it brings up for him, how he tries to cope with that and deal with that, what coping strategies he's developed. And then thinking, given all of that, what would we think are good goals for him if he were to work on that in therapy? I want to invite you to go through that same process in relation to yourself. So this could take quite a bit of time, spending reflecting about how you tend to view yourself in the world. What kind of messages do you give yourself about who you are, how you imagine other people experience you? And in relation to that, what kind of roles or expectations do you have in relation to other people? And looking at that sort of relationship dynamic, spend some time to consider, well, what feelings do I have about that? What feelings am I aware of in myself? And do take some time, because, reflecting back on module 2, where we thought about feelings and emotions in detail, remember we identified how often there's layers of feelings. The initial feeling we might have might be layering on top of other more subtle feelings underneath. And then, having mapped that out, spend a bit of time considering, what does that, how do you deal with that? So you might be someone that feels that you're often trying to please people, or you're often trying to placate people, trying to make sure their needs are met. Or you might be someone who, like Michel, tends to kind of withdraw into yourself and isolate yourself as a way of dealing with, these relationship dynamics. So try and see what it is that you do that in response to that dynamic, and think about, well, does that actually shift it, or does it just keep you in the same cycle? And then, having gone through that process, I'd like to invite you to consider, 1, 2, or 3 key areas or goals that you have to address in therapy, which might be something like, I often spend a lot of time paying attention to thinking about what other people's needs are. I need to learn to better mentalize what's going on for myself. Just as an example, that might be a goal for therapy. The key areas that you feel you really want to address in a therapy going forward. And we've prepared a form for you to write down your reflections in relation to this exercise. And the link to the form is on the web page that we've directed you to access these modules. And when you've completed that, we'd invite you to contact the service to let us know that you've gone through this process with these modules and are ready now to speak again to the person who originally assessed you, to think about and plan with you the next steps. We'd also be really grateful if you would spend a bit of time just filling in the feedback questionnaire that is also on the web link. It'll just help us with evaluating, have we covered the right areas in these modules? How might we modify them for the better? We'd really appreciate your feedback on